Welcome to this introduction of Pemari's Time Slicer for CAPPM. Pemari's Time Slicer library provides a number of functions that enable reading of the CAPPM timescale data blobs, and also the ability with those functions to slice the blobs into a variety of different time periods at runtime. It does this via either row set or scalar functions that can be embedded within SQL statements, and then these SQL statements can again be called from either reports, so embedded within reports, or within portlets, or within gel scripts, wherever you can use SQL. Now, we're not going to go through every single function, scalar or row set within this demonstration because there's just too many and it will take too long. But what we'll do is just cover one or two key functions that typically people would use and just show some example portlets that have been built with those functions. So let's start. So let's log into Clarity. So this in fact is 15.1. Once I'm logged in, then what I've built is just some simple portlet page, resource availability, and on the first tab on here I have a page filter, so I can search for a particular resource. So I'm going to look for Cheryl Amos at the standard demonstration data set, and I can see that I've set a date range of 31st of January to the end of this year, and a filter. So what this is showing me is for a particular resource, shows me their working pattern. So this shows me their shifts out of the calendar for each of the days of the week. What it also then shows me is where their calendar has specific exceptions in it and whether they're working day exceptions, and also then it also shows me where the exceptions exist within the base calendar of the resource. So if I looked for a particular resource which didn't have any overriding calendar exceptions in their resource calendar, then the resource calendar exceptions would appear blank. Now, when I'm looking at this within the concept of slices, it's very difficult to be able to build these, whereas with the Time Slice library, it's very straightforward. So for example, if I now look at the query itself, so I'm just going to open it in a new tab. Search for the Pemari queries, and if I want to look at the calendar days, for example, I can look at the query, and you can see very simply this join here. So I get the resource information, the calendar, and then join it with this function which just goes and gets me the calendar days. I then pivot it just to flatten the rows, because this is a row set function, in order to get the columns Sunday through Saturday. Similarly, for the resource calendar exceptions, if I look at that query, so the resource calendar exceptions query, look at the NSQL for that. Again, apart from the where parameters to restrict what I'm looking at, I can very simply see it's the calendar joined to the calendar function with the blob that gives me the list of calendar exceptions. So now switching back to my portlet page, so that's the first page, just showing me calendar information, which is fairly straightforward to do with the Slice library. If I now look at allocations, then for resource allocations, I've got a drill through, so I can show columns by whichever period I wish. So these are the available and supported period types for these. These are calendar periods, and what I'm showing in this portlet is the availability for the resource on a day-by-day basis, the total allocations of the resource, and then I can drill into the allocations and actually look at the daily allocations on each of the projects. Now, because this is using the library and it's not using the slices, there's no restriction on this, so I can look at weekly for the entire year, daily for the entire year, and also monthly if I wished. Okay, the portlet below shows basically the same as the first portlet, but it just shows it in a graphical form without the detail underneath the allocations. So I can see here that all of a sudden I'm over allocated in March. Now, if I wanted to look in a bit more detail, I could switch to weekly, for example, weekly starting on a Monday. Look in March, and I can see that in March, yeah, I'm over allocated in these periods. And if I look at this for March, I'm on 3 projects, which, if you add them all together, add up to more than 40 hours anyway. So I have a problem in this area that I need to resolve. It's worth highlighting that where you see zeros in the allocations, that means I'm allocated to the project, but I am allocated to it at 0%. When there's a no value in the column, then that's showing that I'm not allocated to the project at all in that period. So you can see for the CRM project, in the week of the 27th, I'm no longer allocated to the project, whereas the PCI controls, I'm not allocated, or the first allocation I have is the 20th of the 2nd. Similarly, I can, for allocations, or for a number of things, look at it in a fiscal way. So for the same person, I'll do it, say, monthly, and for the same period. Then I have a very similar portlet, but this is actually by fiscal period. And again, I can drill into quarterly and annually. Not a lot to show there really, if I change that to 20. And again, because it's reading directly from the blobs, then there's no date range worries. So if I go back to 2010 up to 2020, this shows me all of the annual allocations and availability back to 2010 up to 2020 for 10 years without having to change any slices. And that's the beauty of the library. Because it runs off the blobs, you don't have to try and think ahead and build complexity into your queries in order to say that only allow this range to be a certain range so that it's time boxed. You can actually allow any range that the person may wish to enter, and it will show if there's any data in that period. So let's just switch to monthly. Now again, if I go back to my resources, queries, and if I look at, say, for example, the resource usage graph, then if I look at the functions here, then again, I'm using row set based functions. In this time, I'm using the resource availability function, which goes and gets me all the resource availabilities. And I parameterize the period type here, feed in a period. And then for the second part of the query, I'm going to get the allocations, and this is the group, this is the total allocations. So I cross join the table, calls the resource allocation function, and again with the same period parameter, and that will give me a number of rows. That finishes this introduction to Pemari Time Slicer for CA PPM. Thank you for watching.